This is the second recorded lecture for Biology 1407, Ecological Topics. We're going to start with biomes. So biomes are primarily a terrestrial ecological thing. There are aquatic biomes, but they're not characterized by the same features. Terrestrial biomes are primarily described by the dominant sort of plant life that you find. So in a tropical rainforest, you're going to expect to see tropical trees. It's a forest after all, and lots of other plants associated with it, but the dominant feature is the big trees. It is a forest. As opposed to a temperate deciduous forest, it's also a forest, but there's a very different sort of tree that you're going to find there. Typically deciduous, meaning they lose their leaves during the cold winter. That'll be November, December, January, February in the northern hemisphere. June, July, August in the southern hemisphere, and that'd be a temperate forest. And then a savanna is a grassland, a tropical grassland. A temperate grassland is going to be something like the plains of North America, etc., etc. So these are all characterized by their dominant sort of vegetation. All right. So if we take a look at a global biome map, this looks complicated. You don't have to really memorize it per se, but what we want to talk about is, what are the themes that are going through here? Green very reasonably means lots of green stuff. And so we see kind of a dark green color right here. We're looking at forest. And so this is the equator here. If you're not familiar, with the geography that well, the equator, the equatorial line runs through the northern part of South America, right along about right here. It touches on Lake Victoria right there. I think it's the northern side of Lake Victoria is right on the equator. So there's your line running across the globe. And then, so that's going to be the tropical band right there, which is going to be really wet. That's that very, very wet band we were talking about when we looked at global circulation patterns, because there's low pressure and lots of rainfall right here, because this is the warmest on average warmth, all through the year right here. And then as we work our way north, it's going to get drier and drier. So we're going to move over into grasslands more. Here we're really close to water everywhere, so we tend to have quite a bit of forest, but there's grasslands here in Central America as well. And then as we work our way further north, we start hitting desert regions. Similarly, as we work in desert regions right here, they hit the 30 degrees north desert bands, roughly speaking. Here's some more northern deserts due to inland phenomenon. The center of a continent is almost always desert if the continent is big enough. Grasslands to the south of the rainforest right here, and then getting drier where we have brownish red. They're drier right here. So this is the Namibian desert, which is a famously harsh, dry desert. This band is very thin because the Andes mountains are right on almost on the coastline on the west side of South America, but to the west of that is very, very dry desert. The Peruvian, high Peruvian desert, the northern Chilean desert, the Altiplano, very, very cold right there. Cold and dry, sorry, and so on and so forth. Northern deserts right here. We don't have a lot of northern forests right here. We don't have a lot of big southern forests at the same locale because there's no land at this location. We do have some right at the tip of South America, rich temperate forests here, temperate forests in New Zealand, and a little bit on the southwest coast of Australia. Tasmania down here is more temperate forest, and so on and so forth. So this just kind of gives you a picture with, some good outlines of, the details right here. So, we've got subtropical forest here in Florida and a little bit of the southwest U.S., and then good tropical forest here in the Central American, the Amazonian basin, and so on and so forth. These olive colors or this pale green is grasslands, very, very large grasslands. And notice each forest is surrounded by grassland areas, and then there's going to be, ultimately we'll hit deserty areas, then we'll return to grassland areas, then we'll return to forests. All right. Let's take a look at how you can predict what biome you're going to have where, all right? And so here we're looking at mean rainfall, no water, 100 centimeters per year, 200, 400. 400 centimeters per year is 4 meters of water. That is 12 feet of rain a year. That's a pretty spectacular amount of rainfall. By the way, the world record for most amount of rainfall annually is a particular valley whose name I don't know offhand, in Kauai, the island of Kauai in Hawaii. So I was showing you those islands earlier. The northern inhabited island, the most northwest of the islands, has the wettest spot on Earth. Anyway, if we have enough rainfall, we're going to have forest, right? And then here we have temperature. So here's below freezing, minus 10 degrees centigrade average. Here's freezing, 0 degrees, and then working its way on up here. And these are average temperatures. So that means we can go above and below these values as, we work our way through the year. So what we're looking at right here in this tundra region right here, it falls below freezing for a good chunk of the year, but then it's also going to be above freezing for a portion of the year. And so we do actually have a biome, and we have vegetation right here because there's a part of the year where it's warm enough for vegetation to exist. And then we work our way all the way over here. We're looking at tropical areas right here, tropical rainforest, tropical seasonal forests, subtropical deserts if it's dry enough. And so, this is what we would find based on the rainfall. And so, we've got desert, all the way along here if it's if the rainfall is low enough, and we have forests if there's enough rainfall. And notice as we get colder and colder, the amount of rainfall, the potential rainfall falls because, of course, rainfall is the result of evaporation, which is the result of temperature, thermal energy. So as the average temperature falls, the maximum amount of rainfall that is possible in a location is just going to keep going down. So in northern Alaska, where we have tundra, you're going to get some precipitation. There's going to be a little bit of snow. There's going to be some rain during the late spring and summer when it's above freezing. But not very much. You just can't because the temperatures are too low. And then finally, when we get to polar, Arctic or Antarctic regions, it's just so cold we never have any precipitation because there's no evaporation. So contrary, even though those places are routinely covered with ice and snow, that's ice and snow that fell an awful long time ago from the incredibly rare event of getting some precipitation right here. And because it stays so cold all the time, the stuff piles up and is permanent. So anyway, this is a very useful little tool right here. And notice we work from forests to grasslands to dry grassland, from wet forests to dry forests to grasslands to dry grasslands to deserts. All right. This is a good way of looking at the entire Earth, and this looks really, really busy, but notice it's just the same thing running north and the same thing running south of the equator. And here's the pattern I want to point out to you. So at the equator, we're going to have typically forest, not everywhere around the planet, but on most land at the equator, we're going to have forest of some sort, including really spectacular ones like the Amazon rainforest. And then as we work our way north and south of that, the forest thins out, it gets drier and drier, and eventually it converts over into savanna. Into grassland, and that grassland can have some trees in it like the savannas do, but it's dominated by grasses and fire ecology for that matter. Same thing going south. And then if we go further north, we're going to hit those subtropical deserts, the Mojave, the Sahara. If we go on further north, we're going to hit grasslands that are temperate, cooler grasslands, the prairies of North America, the steppes of Eastern Asia. Those grasslands, and those grasslands will cede to a moisture region. Remember that 60 degrees north, we've got another band of rainfall right there, and we're going to have our forests, our northern forests. Taiga is a northern evergreen forest, and of course a temperate forest would be like the maple-dominated forests of the eastern seaboard of the U.S. And then if we work our way further north, we're going to get back into a very, very attenuated grassland, tundra in North America, permafrost more generally, heading up, just as an example, about 70 degrees north right here. And then finally we yield to desert conditions, very, very cold desert, because we're at the North Pole right here, but indeed desert, very little precipitation, and no vegetation, very little vegetation, quite a bit more vegetation, quite a bit of vegetation, but grassy, because half of the year it's dead. Deserts, because there's so little water right here that we tend to have deserts all the way around the planet at this 30 degrees north latitude, and then increasingly, wet and tropical right here. So all of these areas are pretty, much more verdant and abundant than their equivalent temperate regions right here, because we're going to have more rainfall in tropical rainfall bands than we're going to have rainfall in the temperate rainfall bands, because higher temperatures, lower temperatures. And same thing working our way south right here. There's some examples of particular biomes or locations where we'll find these things, and example latitudes. All right. And then climactic zones. So the word polar, the word temperate, the word tropical has an importance right here. And here it is. In a tropical zone, we never have any freezing. So the vegetation living in a tropical zone has no protection against freezing, but it also doesn't have to expend energy protecting itself from freezing. So it can throw more energy at growth all year long. So we get much more plant stuff in tropical areas than we do in temperate regions where there's a freezing period of some length, sometimes really, really long, which really curtails how much plant growth you can have. And then finally, in a polar region, we have mostly freezing, and that pretty much eliminates the ability of plants to grow. So up here in the polar desert, in the Antarctic polar desert, Antarctica, we pretty much have no plant life because plants must have liquid water. So here's just some pictorial examples, tropical rainforests, and the key idea here is there's a lot of water available at really, really lush growth. Never really any dieback of this material due to extreme changes in climate. This is a very reliable sort of ecosystem right here. Very, very lush, very, very speciose, by far the most productivity on the planet, which means the amount of green stuff growing and then everything else living off of that. Savanna, this would be a tropical grassland, never any freezing weather right here. Cooler, hotter during the hottest time compared to this place, and cooler here during, than the coolest time here, but not freezing again. And these grasslands, you can see it's golden colored right here. Fires are a routine feature right here. So there's very little foresty vegetation because trees are intolerant of low amounts of water or irregular water, and they're quite intolerant of fire. And grasslands tend to dominate where they exist because grasses like fire. They actually do well when a fire roars by once a year because it beats back all the trees, and the grasses can recover quite quickly from fire, and they basically cause fires to occur. Grassland fires are generated by the biology, by the grasses themselves. It's on purpose, if you will. Deserts. These are some different deserts right here. This is a cold northern desert, like the Gobi Desert of China. This is the Sahara Desert that we're familiar with. This would be Arizona and northern Sonora, Mexico. And this is a bit of the Sahara Desert, I think, in North Africa. I believe that's what this photo is. This is certainly the Sonoran. This is the desert southwest. These saguaro cactuses are restricted to just really some of Arizona and some of Sonora State, Mexico. So, if you see these, you know where you are, unless it's like a botanical garden or something. Chaparral, typical of the areas around LA. This is a very dry, scrubby, short woodland that is tolerant of fires. Tolerant of very, very low rainfall. This is classic of a Mediterranean climate where the rain, when it does come, comes in the winter, and in the summer it's long, hot, and dry. Very classic for southern California, for southern Italy, for the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, Greece. All those places look a lot like this. Here's a grassland biome just generally. This could be the rolling plains of North Dakota, or this could be somewhere in Kazakhstan, or even Mongolia over in Asia. It could also be it could be down in South Africa. It's possible. In the southern part of South Africa, there's some extensive grasslands called the veldt. Temperate deciduous forests, so that just means that these lose their leaves annually because we have a cold period with low rainfall that really prohibits plant function, so they go ahead and drop all their leaves and go into a suspended animation and then rejuvenate in the spring. Taiga is a very northern coniferous forest. Think northern Canada, or think of most of Canada, the forested portions of Canada anyway, some of the northern tier of the US. Tundra is the grasslands beyond the taiga when there's not enough rainfall and not enough time above freezing to support tree growth. So the trees fade away and we have quick, luxuriant grasses that pop up around April and May and grow through June, July, August, September, maybe before the season's up. And migratory animals classically come and take advantage of all this growth. They follow the bloom of green north, and then they migrate south in the fall, following looking for where there'll be more food. Let's compare that to freshwater ecological systems. So freshwater systems are really more described by the presence of light and the presence of nutrients rather than the actual vegetation. So they're not really biomes in the strictest sense. We're just going to take a quick look at some considerations in freshwater and then in marine systems. So freshwater means lakes, that's lentic, and lotic systems, streams and rivers, so standing water and moving water. And note that most lakes have streams going into them, rivers going into them, and streams or rivers going out. Those few lakes that don't have streams or rivers coming out of them, those lakes are going to be salt lakes, just like the oceans are salty, and for the same reasons. The study of these bodies of water is called limnology. And what are the things that determine how much life you get in them? Well, temperature. If the water's frozen solid all the time, nothing's going to happen. If it's too hot, we're going to have limitations. How transparent is it? In other words, how far can light move through it? How fast is the water moving? What's the situation with oxygen and CO2, which don't accumulate very much in water unless there's a mechanical introduction or a chemical introduction of these gases into water. So still water has very low oxygen and CO2 concentrations. Moving water has more. Cold water necessarily has more gases. Gases dissolve and stay in water better when it's cold. Hot water has less of the gases right here. So contrary, it might be counterintuitive to you, but temperate and even subtemperate waters, cold waters, are inevitably going to have lots more life in them because of the favorable situation with dissolved CO2 and oxygen compared to hot tropical waters, which are very challenging for most things to live in. How much salt there is and all of that stuff. Fresh water is not all the same freshness. Remember, the Mississippi River at its source is perfectly clear, and at its destination, New Orleans, it's a big, thick, muddy river with a lot of stuff dissolved in the water, so the salt level's gone up quite a bit. Some terminology. Benthos are organisms that live at the bottom of the ocean. Plankton are things that float around in the ocean and that can be divided, or this is lakes now, sorry. Plankton is things that float around in those bodies of water. Phyto is going to be plants, so photosynthetic organisms, and zooplankton are things that, typically eat the phytoplankton, but can't swim against the current, so they're just kind of floating around, and ocean currents or lake currents determine where they are. And then we also have what are called nekton, which are mobile life forms, so fish, and out in the oceans, marine mammals and fast-moving crustaceans, that are able to move and determine where they are, irrespective of what the currents in the water are. And then neuston is a specific name for things that live right on the surface. Primarily, let's just remember benthos, plankton, and nekton. Those are the three terms you really want to pay attention to. Benthos on the bottom, nekton that can move, plankton on the surface, that are moved around by the water without much control over it. So some things that are important. When we look at a lake right here, if the lake is big enough, we're going to have these regions right here. The region where light gets all the way through is called the photic zone. That, and as we get deeper and deeper in the water, the light level gets lower and lower until we hit a point where light is not sufficient to make green stuff grow. And so we're going to have photosynthetic organisms in the photic zone, but we won't have them down here in the profundal zone. We can have life, but it's all going to be heterotrophic. Where the photic zone meets this bottom of the lake, we have what's called the littoral zone, and that's important because aquatic plants and out in the oceans algae that are big, multicellular, can attach to the substrate right here because they can germinate and get enough light right here to grow to get bigger and bigger and get up here and compete for light. A little bit about lakes. Thermally, this is pretty typical for temperate lakes and even for tropical lakes. So we have the epilimion, which is typically quite a bit warmer, as we see right here. The solid line is temperature. And then we have a thermocline, which is where there's a drastic change in temperature. And then we have the hypolimion, which has a lower temperature right here. Now, if the water is still, we get this division: warm water above, cold water below, separated by temperature and density. This is low density water, this is high density water. And since there's no mixing, since these things aren't mixing, if we have mixing, there won't be a thermocline. But if there is, like a still lake, this happens. The oxygen levels get really low in the hypolimnion, and the oxygen levels are better up here, where we've got just mixing across the surface from even the small wave action. And so, in this lake, most of the life is going to be up here in the epilimnion, and the only things living down here are things that can tolerate low levels of oxygen and, low temperatures at the same time. Around here, if you go into the local lakes in the spring here, you jump into the lake, you're swimming around in the epilimnium. If you dive in deep enough, you'll hit the sudden sharp shock of cold water down below. And what you've done is put your leg through or dove down through the thermocline into the cold hypolimnion, and then you pop back up into the warm surface area. Very typical for a temperate lake. All right. Now, the marine environment is a huge and important thing. As you can see, 70% of the Earth's surface. The Earth is mostly rock by volume, but the surface has a thin layer of water on it over about 70% of that surface. Very thin layer of water compared to the full size of the Earth. And the marine environment is effectively one continuous biome because it's all cross-connected. All the marine environments are by definition ultimately connected to each other. A major force, two major forces, that are important in marine environments are the tides caused by the gravitational attraction between the Earth or between the Moon and water on Earth, and then also the gravitational attraction of the Sun on water on Earth. I mean, on the entire Earth, but the water moves due to these gravitational forces, and that's what causes the tides. And when the lunar tides and the solar tides are in conjunction, we get these super, super big tides, and when they're in opposition to each other, we get really, really small tides. An average definition of seawater, 35 parts per thousand salt. So if you take 1,000 molecules of seawater, 1,000 of them, 35 of them are going to be salt. The other 9,965 are going to be water, H2O. All right. As far as growth of vegetation in marine environments, two nutrients are typically the limiters, nitrate and phosphate. So nitrogen in some form and phosphorus are going to be the two things that are hard to get out of the oceans. Plants need these. If they can't get them, they can't make themselves. Phosphorus for phosphorus for nucleic acids and ATP and stuff like that, and nitrogen for both nucleic acids and amino acids, proteins. Remember, animals just get this stuff from the plants they eat, or the animals they eat that ate those plants. Marine environments have the same sort of layer issue right here. They just can be quite a bit bigger because oceans are much, much deeper. So there's still a photic zone, and there's a compensation point where there's not enough light to sustain photosynthesis. The point where that light limit hits the bottom is called the neritic zone. I don't know why they have to have a different name, but it's the equivalent of the littoral zone in a lake environment. Same idea. And that's where we can have photosynthetic organisms encrusting and attached to the bottom right here rather than free floating like they have to be out here, because they can germinate attached to a rock down here and still get enough light to live and then grow tall like the big kelp beds off the coast of California. The lower portion is always underwater. The upper portion, of course, is intertidal between the low and the high tide marks because of the tides, and that adds an interesting extra dynamic right here. The tides and all the wave action of big oceans mean there's a lot more gas mixing in seawater than there is typically in freshwater systems. Lots more oxygen being pumped in via kinetic energy. Some names. Bathel just means the great big deep open part of the ocean that's too deep, too dark to sustain photosynthesis, but it's open ocean. There's a lot of that. The great bulk of the ocean is a Bathel region. And then the abyssal is the deepest portions, including the sea bottom, or the ocean bottoms. We can go all the way down to 23,000 feet down, which would be, I think that's right. Anyway, yeah, shockingly deep. Life in the ocean, some terms as well, you'll recognize some of these. So benthic, is living down in the deeper water.
pelagic, things that move from one part of the ocean to another, but living out in the open ocean. Nekton is swimming and controlling where it's going. Plankton being driven around, moved around by the currents. And again, don't worry about the detailed terms like holoplankton or meroplankton right here. We'll just eliminate those. Let's do that now. How can I? Yeah, I'm just going to grade those out. We don't really need to worry about those. Let me do this up here as well. Yeah, I'm just going to gray out these terms. We don't really want to burn a bunch of time. Oops. Concentrating on that. Okay. All right, so you'll recognize some of these marine habitats, coral reefs, salt marshes, mudflats, estuaries, intertidal zones, sandy beach, and rocky shore. All of these are on the edges. It's sort of close to the boundary between land and water. And in all cases, what that means is the bottom is close to the surface. Your coral reefs, come up very close to the surface of the ocean. We get lots and lots of light. And in all of these cases right here, and most coral reefs, by the way, are also somewhere really, they're on the edge of a continental area. There are coral reefs out in the middle of nowhere. They're kind of the exception rather than the rule. Most coral reefs are on the boundary of a continent. And so they all have the advantage of getting mineral runoff from land, recall your water cycle. And so they get a lot of nutrients coming from land. The place where you get the most life in the oceans is right next to land, where you're high enough to get light and close enough to land to get mineral nutrients washing into the water from ashore. Now, of course, if we get too many mineral nutrients, like agricultural runoff and sewage, we get a big, big problem. So here's an example of a rocky shoreline, and it is just replete with life. You're not going to find this density of life out in the open ocean because there's no nutrients and there's no bottom. Open ocean, in this case off the coast of Hawaii right here, this is a humpback whale. And the whales are over there. They can tolerate long periods without feeding. They come here to kind of get away from predators and to breed. And then they are going to go way up north or way down south. If this is Hawaii, they're probably going to go north and feed in Arctic waters where there's lots of food. They're here to mate and anything but eat. Coral reef in the Red Sea in this particular case right here. And, it's not a biome in the traditional sense because there's not a dominant plant. All these corals are animals. And the reason they have their different bright colors is because they have symbiotic algae living within the coral polyps. And so there is plant life here, or photosynthetic life, but the vast majority of it, there's a little bit of macroalgae right here, but the vast majority of the photosynthetic life is embedded within the coral polyps of a coral community right here. And then those corals end up being primary food for a whole lot of fishes, and then a whole lot of things eat those fishes, et cetera, and so we get a terrific ecology going in this location. Here's an example of a deep sea volcanic vent. The only reason there's light here is because we've got a bright light down here, otherwise this would be pitch black. And this is a volcanic vent releasing sulfur and phosphorus and soluble carbon and some soluble nitrogen and all kinds of things into seawater right here, powering a whole bunch of autotrophic bacteria down here that end up being the basis of a food chain that has nothing to do with light. This again is lit. This is normally totally pitch black, and these are gigantic tube worms right here with a whole bunch of hemoglobin in their gill structures right here, exposed right here, taking oxygen out of the water. And they have a whole bunch of symbiotic bacteria living in them that are chemoautotrophic, living off of all the high energy chemicals here. Notice that little crab right there. And then they in turn, end up being a food source for lots of other things like all of these crabs. Notice the absence of pigment everywhere except red right here, which happens to be hemoglobin for binding oxygen. Otherwise, there's no point having colors because it's pitch black down here. All right.
Now we're going to move into a new topic, and that is population ecology, and that's, how do living things interact with each other? So we've got a couple of things to talk about. The changes in the size and distribution of a population is called population dynamics. birth, death, movement, migration, immigration, all that sort of stuff. Population size, how many individuals are there? What are the characteristics of that population? What do they do? How do they distributed around, and all of that sort of stuff, which is all about density and spacing here. All right, so population dynamics is the study of the change in a population's size and distribution over time. So, how big is the population? How many thousands or millions or billions of individuals are there? If we're talking under thousands, that species is probably on its way out. Very few species can tolerate numbers below at least thousands of individuals. Density, how closely are they, put together? Some species live in very high density collections. Look at this. Look at that. Very, very dense. Where these things occur, they're in very, very dense populations. So that's an example of density. Dispersal, how are they spread out? There's some patterns right there. And then to determine the size of a population, the key thing, right? Well, these things end up being really, really important, all 5 of these. So let me highlight those in a slightly different color. We're going to go for what's something. Oh, well, we'll just go with that. Okay, yeah. So the size of a population is determined by immigration, the movement of individuals into the population. Emigration, the movement of individuals out, E for exit, I for in. Immigration out of a population, births and deaths. And then the nature of survivorship. Do the organisms live a long, long life, before dying off typically, or do most of the individuals die very young? And that's a survivorship thing. And of course, that's going to, go into what's the size of the population. All right. Just as an example of measuring density, we don't have to memorize this, but this is the mark recapture technique for estimating the density of a population, the number of individuals in a given area. Density is number of things in a volume or in an area. And mark recapture is required for counting things that don't want to be counted. Think animals that live in burrows. You want to estimate the number of lizards in an area. You're never going to capture and count every single one, so you use this technique, which gives you a statistical average. If you want to count plants, just count plants. Patterns of dispersion, just as some examples. So those mussels that we were looking at earlier, that would be an example of clumped, around their, rocky shoreline areas. The tube worms we saw down in the abyssal plains, that's going to be around a volcanic caldera of some sort down there. This is a penguin rookery right here. The individual rookeries are distributed kind of like this. They're in their particular locations based on some shared resource, but then within the rookery, they're quite spread out evenly because there's a social distancing, very topical right now, between each animal and a penguin rookery. And then here's a random distribution of some herbaceous flowers scattered in a grassy field right here. All right. When we look at the growth of populations, there's 2 big ideas we want to pay attention to. Exponential growth, which gives you what's called a J-shaped growth curve. That's just a mnemonic. There's not really the high tail part on the J right here. It's more like anyway, we'll see the curve right here. And that illustrates what the rate at which any species can potentially grow if it's not limited by any kind of resource. Infinite food, infinite space, infinite burrows, whatever. And then we've got another model called the logistic growth model, which takes into account the fact that the environment is inevitably finite. Food, soils, water, nesting sites, burrowing spots that are appropriate, whatever it is. There's going to be limitations on, one or more factors that are required for the individuals to be able to exist, and that's going to cap the maximum number of individuals that can live in that area over an extended period of time. And that number is called the carrying capacity. All right, so that's how many individuals of a given species can live in a particular community over an extended period of time, or shall we say indefinitely. So here we've got the J-shaped curve, which is not really a J. They don't have this bit right here. But anyway, there's the exponential growth curve right here. And this is for a rapidly reproducing species, and this is for a slower reproducing species. But both of them can go to infinity given an infinite amount of time. The value is R, which represents growth rate. And so every species has its R value. Some things have very high R values, some things have low R values. Here's an example, elephants, of something with a very low R value. Data from Kruger National Park, South Africa. This data was gathered and tabulated because even though globally, within their range, elephants are at extreme risk because of loss of habitat and small population numbers, in this particular park, the population actually exploded to very high numbers beyond the sustainable carrying capacity of the park. And so they had to, unfortunately, start culling elephant herds by killing them. So here's an example of the logistic model right here. The red line represents that population reaching carrying capacity. And what happens is there are mechanisms, feedback, that inhibit reproduction, like starvation, like increased disease, like stress, whatever it may be, or just inability to find a spot, to make a burrow. But inevitably, that's going to reduce the potential population growth until we hit that K value, the carrying capacity, and then we sit at it. This 1500 is just a random example for something, perhaps having to do with the elephant data back here. Logistic models can vary quite a lot depending on the biology of the organism and its interaction with its environment. Some things approach their carrying capacity smoothly and steadily. Some things overshoot it and then have a crash afterwards and slowly kind of catch up with their carrying capacity. Some things never seem to get equilibrated with their carrying capacity. It just depends. So we can take all living organisms and kind of divide them up into ones that are very sensitive to carrying capacity, like elephants, and things that are very dependent on their rate of growth and have boom and bust cycles in their biology. So most pests and weeds are going to be R selected, while slow growing, high parental investment sort of organisms, think elephants, think whales, think people, are generally K selected, and that we approach that carrying capacity slowly. Now humans don't really count on this because we keep altering our carrying capacity. But most other species, are especially long-lived ones, are very sensitive to that feature. So let's take a look at the human population, and our cycle is consisted of we used to have a lot of booms and busts. Back in human prehistory, we could expect that we would have seen something like this, with a lot of close approaches to extinction way back in our early proto-human and hominid evolutionary lineage. But as we have become more adept at manipulating resources and controlling our environment, our population has ceased rising and falling, and instead, for the last 10,000 years, this is since the innovation of agriculture right here, 8000 BC, the human population has grown slowly until about 1800, when we crossed the 1 billion mark right here. There's a little dip there for the plague, which is huge for us historically, but just a tiny drop in the overall population. At about 1800, we crossed 1 billion right here, and then we've rocketed on up all the way to 7.3. This slide's somewhat old now. I need to get a fresh one. 7.3 billion individuals in the human population now. That is very much a J-shaped curve. And so remember, we can't experience a J-shaped curve forever because there's a finite number of resources on Earth, so that applies to the human population as well. This graph right here shows the percentage increase in the human population over time. So that's, how many new individuals we're getting versus how many we lose, and a positive value means the population is growing. A negative value below this would mean the population shrinking. So back in the 1950s, the population was growing pretty quickly. By 1965 or so, right here on this graph, the average, global human population was, replacing at 2.2% of the population per year getting added into the human population. Now it's falling. And we're right here at about 2020 now. So again, this graph shows the age. I need to pick up fresh graphs, but they wouldn't have changed much. And we're going to see that so our real data gets up to 2009 here. And so the rate of growth of the human population is falling, but the population is still climbing. As long as it's positive here, the population is growing. And even though the rate is falling, we've always got a bigger and bigger and bigger number of people that we're adding a small percentage to. So the absolute rate of growth of the population is still quite astronomical. All right. When we look at living things out there, what is it that contributes to their carrying capacity? We can divide those things up into what we call abiotic factors, non-living things, soil, water, temperature, rocks, mineral nutrients, and then the biotic factors, food sources, things they have to eat, competitors, things that are eating them, things that are competing with them, fighting for the same food but not eating them, and all those other interactions between one living thing and another. Liebig's law of the minimum just suggests that for all living organisms, there's usually one resource. It might be abiotic, it might be biotic, that is the limiter of the size of that population. And so if you can increase that one resource, suddenly the whole population can increase. If you increase any of the other resources but don't change that limiting resource, the population's not going to change. At least it won't go up. All right, so what are some biotic factors? Any interaction between one living thing and another, predator-prey relationships, disease, disease is a biotic factor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So when a population is growing, we can look at the things that are controlling its growth and then relate them to the density of the population and break them apart into density dependent and density independent. And those are partially correlated with biotic and abiotic. All right, so density-dependent growth factors are, A, the intrinsic rate of reproduction of the species are, do they have a lot of offspring or not many? How rapidly are they dying? What are some diseases? Remember, a high population, like the human population, a disease can really move through it quickly, like the COVID-19 situation currently. Competition with other organisms or, members of your own species for food. So all of these things right here are a result of density. High density, these all limit growth of the population. Low density, these things don't limit the growth of the population. Density independent factors tend to be abiotic, floods, tidal waves, weather extremes, and stuff like that. And there's a misunderstanding about how these things work right here. So if I have a big heavy city like New York City and we have an earthquake right there, obviously lots and lots of people are going to die due to that earthquake. Whereas if the same earthquake happened in the middle of rural Kansas and just, where there's a few small little villages or towns, I should say, you can assume that far fewer people are going to die. So you might think that density plays a role in it, but the chance of an individual dying due to the earthquake in either New York or in the right location in Kansas is exactly the same. Density has no effect. Lightning strikes. If you get hit by lightning, you're dead. If there's a big pile of people standing still, the chance of any one individual getting hit by lightning is the same as if there was just one person. Density has no effect. All right, tidal waves, floods, all of those things. It doesn't mean that these can't occur where there's a lot of people, but the chance of killing an individual person or an animal, whatever the thing is not dependent on the number of individuals right there. They stand the same chance no matter what, as opposed to these factors, disease, competition, food, shelter. All of these are extremely sensitive to the number of individuals piled together. All right. So let's talk about a community and an ecosystem. We've talked about that a little bit. So a community is simply all the species that interact with each other in these ways. They make up the community, and that's an ecological community. All right. And then if we want to move up a step and talk about the ecosystem, we're just going to go ahead and include the biotic factors as well as the abiotic factors, and that's what makes up an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is a community plus the abiotic factors that that community is dependent on and shaped by amount of sunlight, amount of nutrients, temperature profile, everything. All right. A very important idea when we take a look at ecology and ecosystems is the movement of energy and matter through that ecosystem. And that's how we tend to analyze and characterize ecosystems. We've watched the energy flow and the nutrient flow through these groups. Hopefully you're familiar with these terms right here. Trophic levels, which is, where they are in the food chain, if you will. So the beginning of every food chain must have an autotroph. And that could be a photoautotroph, things that are photosynthetic, what we're most familiar with. Or it can be chemoautotrophic. Let me roar back. Chemoautotrophic. There are autotrophs here, but they don't use sunlight. They use high-powered chemistry. That's what we mean by autotrophs. Most of the autotrophs we think of are green, of course. And then consumers, things that are heterotrophic must get their food from their environment. And we've got a theoretically infinite list, although in practicality it's limited. Primary consumers are things that eat autotrophs. Secondary consumers are things that eat primary consumers. So, a lion eating a deer, which eats grass. A tertiary consumer is going to be a predator that eats a predator that eats herbivores that eat, autotrophs. And we can have quaternary predators, quaternary predators. On land, this is about as far as we go normally. In the water, we typically can have more trophic levels. And on land, in the world of arthropods and, non-vertebrates, we can have a few more trophic levels sometimes. It just depends on the details. And then inevitably decomposers, which break down all of these guys when they're dead, or sometimes when they're still alive. Those are predatory saprophytes and things like that, predatory decomposers, things that we would call disease-causing organisms. Here's an example of a closed ecosystem right here. And this is meant to highlight a very, very important idea. And that is that an ecosystem is energetically open. Energy must come from somewhere and is balanced by energy leaving. If energy comes in but doesn't leave, the whole thing gets hotter and hotter. That's what we mean by global warming due to increases in greenhouse gases, until we hit a new balance where the amount of energy coming in is matched by the energy leaving. But that'll happen when we reach a higher average temperature. And it's materially closed. This greenhouse here is sealed, and you can make an airtight one right here if you're careful with it. And you've got all the organisms recycling matter round and round and round. That's that biogeochemical recycling. The Earth itself biogeochemically recycles all of its matter. No new stuff needs to come from space. But it's powered. All of the ecology of the planet, and indeed a lot of the geochemistry of the planet, is powered by sunlight coming in and balanced by heat leaving. So ecosystems are energetically open and materially closed. All right. So here we're looking at just an example of what happens with energy in living things. This is a caterpillar eating leaves right here. You could quantify all of this. This is an exercise we can do in a different sort of laboratory environment. So, we can account for all of the chemical energy contained in some leaves, let's say 200 joules right here. And what happens to that, the potential energy of that plant matter as it's being eaten by a caterpillar? Well, as you can see right here, half of it's lost as feces. So those feces have a huge amount of energy. That's why there's so many living things, including lots of fungi and bacteria, that live on feces, and quite a few animals that are specialists in consuming feces, and et cetera, because there's a lot of energy left in the feces coming out of a heterotroph. As you can see for this caterpillar, 67 joules, so just over 25%, about 30% of the energy is used just to keep the animal alive, cellular respiration, and only about 33 joules, so 15%, 16% specifically, 16.5% is available to pay for growth of the animal. And that is a very interesting thing. So efficiency, how much energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next? On average, let's just say about 10%. Some things do a little bit better, some things do worse. A good rule of thumb is 10%, and that's the one I want you to memorize. 10% of energy making it from one trophic level to the next. So that's why we can characterize any ecosystem in this way right here and create this ecological pyramid with the producers down at the base, the largest number of them. How much of their matter successfully gets turned into primary consumers? About 10%. How much of that matter in the primary consumers gets converted into the bodies of secondary consumers, predators? About 10%. How much of them gets converted into the energy of a tertiary consumer? About 10%. This pyramid doesn't give those numbers exactly. It'd be more like a stepped pyramid. Yeah, I don't have an example. Let me go ahead and get an example. All right, so here's a good example right here. These are pyramids of numbers and pyramids of biomass for 3 simple food chains, as it says right here. So grass, rabbit, fox, tree. And think about it, the bulk of the tree doesn't change over the year, just the leaves. Okay, just the leaves. Insects, predatory insect, bird, predatory bird. So this is a primary consumer, secondary, tertiary, quaternary consumer right here. And then grass, zebra, lion, pretty obvious. Okay, and so here, the pyramids of numbers, a whole lot of grass, far fewer rabbits, and very few foxes, roughly 10%, moved across, from level to level. And if you actually weighed them all up, you'd get something really darn similar. A whole lot of grass mass, necessarily far less rabbits, and then a much smaller amount of foxes right here. And what this is suggesting is just a fairly high energy transfer between grass and rabbits, so maybe up around 20% or 30% or something like that. But the transfer of energy from rabbit to fox is much lower, around 10% or something like that. Because remember, foxes have to burn a huge amount of energy hunting, and only occasionally do they catch a rabbit, whereas rabbits just eat. Same sort of things going on right here, but that would explain this situation right here. If we look at the pyramid of numbers, we just get this small one tree right here, a whole lot of herbivorous insects, a whole bunch of carnivorous insects, and so on and so forth. But then the biomass of leaves on the tree is still a really big number right here. So the details of these pyramids are terribly dependent on what you're actually looking at. And very interestingly, marine ecologies, the actual biomass of green stuff is going to look a lot like this. They grow incredibly quickly, but everything's almost instantly eaten by these things, which are also in small numbers, and then these things look disproportionately large. There's terrific productivity at these 2 levels in a marine environment, but everything gets eaten. The phytoplankton is instantly eaten by the zooplankton, and all the zooplankton is instantly eaten by the filter feeders and all of that. And then we get into kind of normal-looking pyramids. So just a little detail there. So here we're looking at that 10% rule. Grasses, 10% converted into grasshoppers, 10% of that converted into field mice, 10% of field mice converted into rattlesnakes. So this brings us to something that's pretty obvious, a food chain. Here's 2 different food chains, a terrestrial one and a marine one. And, that just means this eats that, which is eaten by that, which is eaten by that, which is eaten by that. As opposed to a food web, which is more realistic, and all stable ecologies consist of fairly complex food webs. Very, very weak ecologies, very vulnerable ecologies, ones that are unstable, are overly characterized by food chains. And food chains are dangerous because if something becomes extinct or very rare right here, everything above it in the food chain loses out unless it can switch to some other new food. And you can bet these sailfish, I think right here, or marlin or something like that, they can eat salmon, but they sure as heck can't eat zooplankton, so they're going to be dead, and therefore so will the killer whales, which certainly can't eat zooplankton. That's the danger of a food web. Just like, red-tailed hawks are going to have a really hard time trying to stay alive eating grasshoppers. They can live eating
snakes or rodents, but they're not going to make it on just grasshoppers. Whereas a food web with lots of multiple choices, and this is the argument for biodiversity. This is why we want high biodiversity. If any one rare thing becomes rare because of disease or accident or human damage, there's fallbacks. There's other things for each species to eat, and so the whole system stays functioning. Now, as you continue knocking out individuals of this food web and reducing it more and more and more to food chains, that's when we get into ecological collapse, which is a great concern all around the world right now, because we're reducing numbers, so many species of so many things in so many different categories, that we're simplifying food webs everywhere into food chains. We live on a food chain. Corn, feeding cows, feeding people. We're extraordinarily vulnerable to food chain disruptions. People say it'll never happen. Those are the same people who say global pandemics will never happen. And witness where we are right now. This could be far, far worse, but it could also be a lot better. Same thing for ecological collapse. So once we get finished with our disease prevention issues, we really must get back to protecting the ecology of the planet.